Steady now, boys. Keep your eyes forward. Wait for the ramp to drop. Get back, Flamethrower! We have to move now! It's burning everything! Retreat! All hands, battle stations!
Report status on the forward deck. Ammunition ready.
Keep your eyes on that ridge! Check the pressure valve on the auxiliary tank.
Looks good to go, Sergeant. Ready for deployment.
Ready on the M2! Fire! Direct stream, range is good. Cut it!
January 1945. The morning sun rises over the Pacific, pale and hazy, barely cutting through the smoke curling above the distant reefs. The sea is deceptively calm, a mirror for the sky, yet the horizon trembles with the silhouettes of U.S. landing craft creeping toward the shore. From the decks of the armored ships, flamethrowers hiss and roar, tongues of fire leaping from the water like molten snakes. On the beaches, Japanese infantry cling to their bunkers, eyes widening as the first columns of flame surge across the sand. The smell of burning wood, rations, and smoke fills the air, mingling with the salt tang of the ocean. A soldier drops his rifle, frozen, as the heat ripples toward him. Around him, comrades scramble through a haze of fear and confusion, their disciplined formations dissolving under an unrelenting wall of fire. Explosions punctuate the roar, mortar shells scattering sand, but it is the flames, unpredictable, consuming, inhuman, that dominate. In this moment, the balance of power shifts silently, terrifyingly, before a single shot is fired from the defenders. The assault is only beginning, but the shock has already taken hold. By late 1944, the Pacific War had entered a decisive and brutal phase. The Japanese Empire, once confident in its defensive perimeter stretching from the Philippines to the Marianas, now faced relentless assaults from U.S. forces across the islands of the Central and Western Pacific. Each amphibious landing revealed the grim reality of Japanese defensive doctrine. Deeply entrenched bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and fortified cave systems that turned even small islands into death traps for assaulting troops. American commanders had learned the hard way that traditional naval bombardment and infantry attacks often failed to neutralize these positions. The Japanese had perfected a grim defensive art. On Saipan and Tinian, soldiers and civilians alike were funneled into underground fortifications that could withstand artillery, bombs, and naval gunfire. From these hidden perches, machine guns and mortars could sweep beaches in calculated, deadly arcs. Every advance required painstaking coordination, high casualties, and the grim knowledge that each foot gained would be bought with blood. The Pacific Islands terrain magnified these challenges. Coral ridges, dense vegetation, and volcanic rock created natural obstacles. Enemy soldiers could vanish into caves or slit trenches, emerging unpredictably to deliver devastating fire. Conventional artillery and rifle fire often proved ineffective against these defensive works. In response, U.S. engineers and tacticians began to innovate, seeking weapons capable of forcing defenders from their sanctuaries. Flamethrowers, initially designed for close-range infantry assaults, began to appear as a potential solution, but their deployment from land-based positions remained slow, risky, and dangerous under fire. As the Allies prepared for the next wave of assaults, the question became not just how to neutralize Japanese defenses, but how to do so without repeating the staggering casualties of previous battles. Naval planners and Marine commanders collaborated on unconventional solutions. The idea emerged. What if flamethrowers could be mounted on landing craft, transforming the water itself into a conduit of fire? By projecting flames directly from ship to shore, the U.S. Navy could suppress fortified positions before infantry even set foot on the sand. This innovation was not conceived lightly. Engineers had to contend with the corrosive effects of salt water, the stability of the vessel, and the immense fuel requirements for sustained fire. Each flamethrower-equipped landing craft, known as the LVT-4 Alligator with the M2-2 flamethrower modification, carried thousands of gallons of fuel in pressurized tanks, protected by armored plating. Crews trained tirelessly to coordinate movement, targeting, and timing, knowing that a single misfire could destroy the craft or endanger the infantry they were meant to support. Meanwhile, Japanese defenders were largely unaware of this technological evolution. Intelligence reports underestimated American innovation, assuming that naval bombardment would continue to precede infantry in the familiar, deadly rhythm of the island campaigns. No training exercise or reconnaissance had prepared them for the sight of flames erupting directly from the water, encroaching on sand and coral before bullets or shells had even reached their positions. This gap in knowledge would soon become brutally evident. The psychological dimension of warfare had always played a role in Pacific campaigns. Japanese soldiers were trained to fight to the death, but they had never faced fire projected in such an indiscriminate, overwhelming manner. Traditional fears of artillery, naval guns, and airstrikes were grounded in known physics and predictable patterns. Flamethrowers, particularly those fired from the sea, introduced chaos into the familiar. Flames could curve over obstacles, slide into trenches, and ignite everything within reach. The roar of pressurized fuel, combined with smoke and searing heat, created a sensory environment designed to disorient, frighten, and dominate defenders before combat even began. This combination of technological innovation, tactical necessity, and psychological impact set the stage for the events that would unfold on the beaches of the Pacific Islands. The flamethrowers' arrival marked a turning point in amphibious warfare, one that would leave an indelible mark on both attackers and defenders. Soldiers on both sides would soon learn that the sea itself could become a weapon, delivering fire with precision and relentless intensity. As the first craft began to leave the transport ships, engines churning and flamethrowers primed, the battle lines of the Pacific were about to be rewritten. The shock awaiting the Japanese defenders would not be merely physical. It would strike at the very core of their expectations, their training, and their ability to hold ground. The development of ship-mounted flamethrowers was a response born from necessity, forged in the fires of earlier Pacific campaigns. Infantry assaults on fortified islands had repeatedly exposed the limits of conventional weaponry. On Tarawa and Saipan, Marines found themselves pinned on beaches while Japanese defenders, shielded by reinforced bunkers and underground networks, rained bullets and mortar shells upon them. Each advance required months of planning, extensive artillery preparation, and yet, even with overwhelming numbers, casualty rates remained catastrophic. U.S. engineers sought to transform this vulnerability into an advantage. Early experiments mounted flamethrowers on LVT for amphibious vehicles, allowing operators to approach enemy positions under armor. The success of these land-based flamethrowers inspired a more ambitious concept, projecting fire directly from ships to shore. Naval architects collaborated with Marine Corps ordnance teams to adapt flamethrower mechanisms for waterborne deployment. This required pressurized fuel systems capable of firing streams of napalm up to 60 to 70 yards, protected by reinforced hulls and armored turrets. Stability was a constant concern. The recoil from the flame projection could destabilize the vessel, particularly in rough surf. Operational trials were conducted at remote Pacific atolls. Crews practiced firing at mock fortifications under simulated combat conditions, refining timing, fuel pressure, and coordination with infantry landings. By late 1944, flamethrower-equipped ships were deemed combat-ready. Their arrival represented a new layer in the U.S. assault strategy: suppress, intimidate, and neutralize fortified positions before boots touched the sand. Japanese intelligence, however, remained largely unaware of this development. Reconnaissance had noted American experimentation with amphibious vehicles, but the idea of projecting fire from naval platforms seemed improbable to the defenders. Their planning still relied on expectations shaped by previous engagements. Naval bombardments, air raids, and infantry attacks delivered in predictable waves. In entrenched bunkers and caves, Japanese soldiers braced for artillery but had no preparation for fire arriving from the sea itself. Indirect, unexpected, and devastatingly immediate. The flamethrowers' effectiveness was not merely physical. The visual terror of walls of fire advancing across a beach, combined with the suffocating heat and acrid smoke, introduced a psychological weapon that exploited fear and confusion. Unlike shelling or small arms fire, which could be countered with cover or tactical maneuvering, flamethrowers left little room for adaptation. Entire defensive positions could be rendered untenable within minutes. Commanders recognized that the sudden, overwhelming presence of fire could break cohesion, forcing surrender or retreat before infantry even engaged. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy had integrated these flamethrower-equipped craft into amphibious task forces. Tactical planning emphasized synchronized attacks, naval gunfire to soften targets, followed by the precise deployment of flamethrowers, and finally, infantry landings to exploit the suppressed defenses. The combined arms approach maximized shock value while minimizing casualties among the attacking forces. Yet, uncertainty remained. Operating flamethrowers in combat conditions carried immense risk. Fuel lines could rupture, mechanical failures could occur under enemy fire, and smoke could obscure vision for the landing craft operators. Despite these dangers, the potential payoff: a rapid, decisive neutralization of fortified positions, made the risk acceptable to commanders determined to break the cycle of bloody stalemates on Pacific beaches. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both innovation and resolve. On the morning of the assault, the Japanese defenders remained poised in their trenches, unaware of the lethal surprise approaching from the water. From the armored decks of U.S. ships, flamethrowers hissed and roared, the heat radiating across the surf. A new chapter of warfare was about to be written, one in which fire itself would dictate the tempo of battle. For the Japanese infantry, the arrival of flames from the water was more than just a new weapon. It was a confrontation with the unexpected. Soldiers who had trained for months in camouflage, marksmanship, and bunker defense found themselves paralyzed, confronted by a force that defied conventional logic. Flamethrowers projected fire over sand, through narrow trenches and into fortified positions, igniting everything in their path. The roar of the pressurized fuel, the hiss of burning napalm, and the waves of searing heat created an environment where fear became tangible. Eyes widened, hands trembled. Comrades screamed as the fire approached, some abandoning their positions, others attempting futile resistance. This was not merely physical danger. It was psychological domination, instantaneous and absolute. Reports from surviving Japanese soldiers later described a sense of disbelief, as though the sea itself had turned against them. They had anticipated artillery, bombs, and infantry attacks, but never a wall of fire advancing over the surf. Even experienced veterans, hardened by previous island campaigns, described the sight as terrifying, surreal. The human cost was immediate, not just in lives lost, but in cohesion shattered and morale broken. The Flamethrowers' engineering represented a leap in amphibious warfare technology. The LVT-4 Alligator, modified with the M2-2 flamethrower system, carried thousands of gallons of thickened fuel in armored tanks. Pressurized lines allowed operators to fire streams of napalm up to 70 yards, enough to reach in-trench positions before infantry disembarked. The system was designed for both durability and mobility. Thick armor plating protected operators from small arms fire, while the craft's amphibious capabilities enabled it to traverse reefs, sandbars, and shallow waters that would otherwise obstruct traditional vehicles. The design also accounted for coordination with naval artillery. Flamethrowers were deployed after preliminary bombardment to exploit weakened defenses. Engineers balanced fuel capacity with stability, knowing that too much weight could capsize the craft in surf, while too little would limit operational effectiveness. Every aspect of the design was tested under controlled conditions before being approved for combat deployment, a meticulous combination of mechanical precision and tactical foresight. From a tactical perspective, flamethrowers transformed the way U.S. forces approached fortified islands. Previously, assaulting a bunker or cave system required prolonged bombardment, risky infantry maneuvers, and high casualty rates. Now, a single craft could suppress multiple positions simultaneously. The fire served both as a weapon and a psychological tool, clearing paths for Marines to advance with reduced risk. Commanders coordinated timing carefully. The flamethrower-equipped landing craft would arrive just as waves of infantry touched the water, projecting fire over beach obstacles and into enemy fortifications. This disrupted Japanese firing patterns, neutralized machine gun nests, and prevented defenders from mounting organized counterattacks. The combined effect was a dramatic increase in operational efficiency. Fewer Marines exposed to small arms fire, faster clearance of entrenched positions, and a decisive edge in maintaining momentum during assaults. American leadership recognized the dual value of flamethrowers, tactical and psychological. Commanders at both the Navy and Marine Corps levels understood that success in the Pacific was not merely a matter of firepower, but of morale. Decision-making focused on integrating these weapons into broader amphibious operations. Task forces were structured to ensure maximum coordination. Artillery and air support softened targets. Flamethrowers followed to neutralize fortifications, and infantry capitalized on disrupted defenses. Leadership also required careful management of risk. Fuel explosions, mechanical failure, or miscommunication could result in catastrophic losses. Officers emphasized rigorous training, detailed operational planning, and redundancy in deployment. The careful orchestration of firepower, movement, and timing underscored the importance of adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. Flamethrowers, particularly those mounted on ships, raised moral and psychological questions for both attackers and defenders. For the Japanese, the sudden and overwhelming presence of fire shattered expectations, creating terror and confusion. For American operators, deploying fire against human targets demanded discipline and focus under stressful conditions. The weapon's effectiveness relied on its ability to intimidate as much as destroy, making psychological impact a deliberate component of tactical planning. Historians note that flamethrowers exemplify the intersection of innovation and human psychology in warfare. Unlike conventional artillery, which can be observed and anticipated, fire introduced unpredictability and sensory overload. The human response, panic, disorientation, and instinctive flight, was as decisive as physical destruction. In this way, flamethrowers redefined the battlefield, shaping outcomes before soldiers even fully engaged in combat. From the Japanese perspective, the flamethrowers arriving from the water were bewildering and terrifying. Defenders who had relied on carefully prepared positions, bunkers, caves, and pillboxes, suddenly found themselves facing a threat that violated all expectations of the battlefield. Smoke and fire poured across the sand, spilling into trenches and collapsing firing points. Traditional defensive tactics proved ineffective. Bullets and mortars could not reach the source of the flames, and counterattacks were stymied by the overwhelming heat and disorientation. Japanese officers quickly realized that their previous assumptions about American tactics no longer held. The once predictable rhythm of artillery barges, followed by infantry landings, was shattered. The flames forced soldiers to abandon strongpoints, leaving gaps that could be exploited by advancing Marines. Reports from survivors described chaos. Units became isolated, communication broke down, and soldiers either fled or were trapped. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical destruction, eroding morale and undermining cohesion. Japanese command struggled to adapt to this unprecedented weapon. Senior officers recognized the flamethrowers as a new form of combined arms assault, but their options were limited. Countermeasures, such as reinforcing bunkers with additional sandbags or creating diversionary trenches, could not be implemented quickly enough. Attempts to engage the landing craft with artillery or small-caliber naval guns were largely ineffective due to both the armor of the vessels and the timing of the attacks. The inability to respond effectively forced Japanese leaders into reactive decision-making. Retreat and consolidation became the default, not a choice. Frontline units, trained to fight to the last man, were now confronted with a weapon that demanded surrender or death, not from bullets or shells, but from fire itself. Commanders struggled to maintain morale, issuing orders to hold positions despite the visible devastation, but the unpredictability of the flamethrowers eroded confidence at every level. Flamethrowers fired from ships represented a broader evolution in amphibious warfare. Previously, engineers had focused on armor, mobility, and artillery support. Fire added a new dimension, the ability to neutralize enemy defenses at range without prolonged bombardment or costly infantry maneuvers. Strategically, this allowed U.S. forces to shorten engagement timelines and reduce casualties. Islands that might have required weeks of attritional combat could now be seized more rapidly, changing the calculus of the Pacific campaign. The combination of naval, air, and flamethrower support exemplified an integrated approach to assault operations. Task forces synchronized each element to maximize effect. Preliminary shelling softened defenses, flamethrowers cleared remaining positions, and infantry advanced into the gap. This model would influence subsequent operations, setting a precedent for fire-based suppression in amphibious assaults. The use of flamethrowers, particularly against entrenched infantry, generated moral and ethical considerations even among Allied forces. The weapon's psychological impact was undeniable. Fear, panic, and terror were weaponized alongside physical destruction. Soldiers operating these flamethrowers had to maintain composure under heat, smoke, and incoming fire, delivering lethal effects while navigating their own moral responses to the devastation they caused. Historical accounts suggest that some U.S. Marines viewed flamethrowers as essential tools of survival rather than instruments of cruelty. The weapon's effectiveness in reducing infantry casualties outweighed concerns over psychological trauma inflicted on the enemy. Nonetheless, flamethrowers became a symbol of the brutal calculus of Pacific warfare, technology that maximized tactical advantage while exploiting human fear, often in horrifyingly direct ways. From an operational standpoint, flamethrowers allowed task forces to tackle the most heavily fortified positions with unprecedented efficiency. Engineers and commanders mapped target zones meticulously, identifying bunkers and caves most likely to impede the landing. Flamethrowers could reach positions that artillery or mortars could not, projecting fire into covered areas and neutralizing threats before infantry engagement. The coordination of flame with supporting fire ensured that defenders had minimal opportunity to regroup or counterattack. The operational success of flamethrowers on one island often dictated strategy on the next. Lessons learned in early deployments informed planning for subsequent assaults, improving timing, coordination, and training. Units became familiar with the tactical rhythm of combined arms firepower, approach, suppression, and advance. The shock inflicted on Japanese defenders in one engagement resonated in future battles, shaping both enemy expectations and Allied assault doctrine. Finally, the cultural impact of flamethrowers on the battlefield cannot be understated. For Japanese soldiers, deeply rooted in traditions of honor, courage, and steadfast resistance, the sudden presence of inescapable flames challenged not only military strategy, but personal values. Panic, fear, and confusion disrupted disciplined defense, undermining cultural expectations of resistance at all costs. For American forces, mastery of this technology reinforced confidence and morale. Observing entrenched positions neutralized without direct infantry casualties validated months of innovation, experimentation, and risk. Fire became more than a weapon. It became a psychological lever, shaping outcomes before bullets were even fired. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. The first light of dawn barely illuminated the jagged coastline, but the sea churned with the approaching U.S. fleet. Among the waves, armored landing craft cut through the surf, their flamethrowers primed and ready. For weeks, Japanese commanders had fortified Shuri line positions along the ridges and caves, expecting a conventional assault. They were prepared for naval bombardment, machine gun fire, even mortar shells, but not for fire projecting from the water itself. The first craft surged forward. Crewmen gripped controls, eyes fixed on the distant sand. The flamethrowers ignited with a roar, molten streams of napalm arching over the surf. Japanese defenders froze, initially uncertain of what they were witnessing. Smoke and heat rolled across the beaches, igniting wooden structures, fuel caches, and any exposed equipment. The initial shock was total. Entire firing positions were engulfed within moments, the roar of the flames competing with distant artillery and small arms fire. On the ground, Marines advanced behind the protective wall of fire. The flames forced Japanese infantry from bunkers, leaving them exposed to precision rifle and machine gun fire. Retreat was impossible. The beach was a corridor of fire, and the terrain offered no cover. Soldiers who attempted to regroup in trenches found the heat intolerable, smoke stinging eyes and lungs. In less than 10 minutes, positions that might have required hours of attritional combat were rendered untenable. The coordination between ships and infantry was critical. Naval officers signaled the timing of bursts, ensuring that flames swept over key strongpoints just as Marines landed. Engineers had meticulously calculated ranges and fuel pressure, and the result was devastatingly effective. The first wave of craft neutralized multiple bunkers, while follow-on waves cleared caves and slit trenches that had previously resisted shelling. From Japanese reports, survivors later described the scene as surreal. Water itself seemed to burn, a force beyond comprehension. Amid the chaos, Japanese officers attempted to issue orders. Small pockets of soldiers tried to mount counterattacks or return fire, but confusion reigned. Communications were disrupted by smoke, explosions, and sheer terror. Soldiers abandoned positions in waves, some attempting to flee inland, others trapped by advancing flames. Commanders faced the impossible choice of sacrificing men to hold lines or ordering retreats that might appear cowardly but preserved life. This was not a single, isolated moment. It was a cascade. Each flamethrower-equipped craft amplified the effects of the others, creating overlapping zones of heat and fire. Where one vehicle forced surrender or flight, another prevented regrouping. The Japanese defensive network, meticulously prepared over months, collapsed under the relentless pressure of flame and coordinated assault. Amid the carnage, Marines moved with calculated precision. Behind the roar of fire and the haze of smoke, they navigated obstacles and debris, clearing the way for subsequent waves. The flamethrowers had not only suppressed enemy positions, but also dictated the rhythm of the landing. Units advanced faster, with fewer casualties than previous island operations, and the Japanese defenders, disoriented and terrified, were unable to mount coherent resistance. The psychological impact was immediate and undeniable. Soldiers who had faced artillery and machine gun fire without faltering now abandoned fortified positions under the elemental terror of fire. Commanders observed that entire platoons surrendered or fled, driven more by fear than by exhaustion or injury. The human element, combined with technological superiority, shifted the balance of power on the battlefield in a matter of minutes. By mid-morning, the first lines of Japanese defense along the targeted beachhead had effectively ceased to exist. Where soldiers had once clung to caves and bunkers, only smoldering ruins and scatter bodies remained. The flamethrowers, integrated into the assault with meticulous timing, had achieved a decisive effect. What would have been a prolonged, bloody engagement was transformed into a rapid, devastating strike. In this moment, the tide of battle shifted. The combination of human shock, technological innovation, tactical precision, and psychological dominance converged to create a turning point. Japanese forces were no longer merely defending. They were reacting, retreating, and attempting to survive against a weapon that had rewritten the rules of engagement. The success of this initial assault set the stage for the remainder of the campaign. Commanders recognized the strategic potential of flamethrowers fired from ships, the ability to neutralize fortified positions with speed, efficiency, and minimal risk to friendly forces. But the victory came at a human cost, a stark reminder of the brutal calculus of warfare in the Pacific. By late morning, the initial shockwave of fire had transformed the battlefield. Japanese defenders, once confident in the strength of their bunkers and caves, were now scattered, disoriented, and overwhelmed. Smoke hung heavy over the sand, curling into the ridges where secondary positions had been prepared. The roar of flamethrowers mingled with the staccato of rifle fire, the pounding of naval guns, and the occasional explosion of trapped ammunition. The landscape itself seemed to convulse under the assault, a living testament to the destructive power of coordinated fire. Despite the chaos, pockets of Japanese resistance persisted. In one hillside bunker, a small squad refused to yield. They returned fire sporadically, attempting to hold the line, but the advancing flames rendered their efforts futile. Thick napalm coated the entrance to their position, forcing them to either retreat into confined tunnels or be consumed by fire. The Marines, advancing behind the protective wall of flame, approached cautiously, knowing that even small amounts of resistance could cause significant casualties. The calculated intimidation of the flamethrowers meant that many of these defenders surrendered without inflicting heavy losses, their morale shattered by the relentless heat and smoke. Meanwhile, on the water, U.S. naval officers monitored the progress of their craft with precision. Coordination was paramount. Timing each burst of fire ensured overlapping zones of suppression. One misfire could expose infantry to concentrated enemy fire or leave a pocket of defenders intact. Crews rotated fuel tanks and monitored pressure gauges, maintaining streams of fire that surged like molten rivers across the beach. The technical mastery of the operation was as critical as the bravery of the Marines advancing behind it. Elsewhere on the island, flamethrowers cleared networked cave systems that had previously repelled repeated bombardments. The Japanese had carved complex tunnels into volcanic rock, creating interlocking defensive positions. Conventional artillery had little effect, but fire, guided by careful observation from the craft, could be projected directly into entrances. Smoke and heat forced defenders to the surface or drove them from their tunnels entirely. It was in these confined spaces that the flamethrowers' psychological impact was most pronounced. Soldiers faced not just the physical threat of burning, but the realization that no position, however fortified, could guarantee safety. The chaos on the beach and ridges created further opportunities. As Japanese units attempted to regroup inland, Marines and flamethrower crews exploited every gap. Machine guns swept across escape routes, while flamethrowers cut off potential fallback positions. The integration of naval and infantry firepower allowed the assault to maintain momentum, preventing the defenders from establishing coherent countermeasures. Amid the devastation, individual acts of heroism punctuated the battle. Marines braved the edge of the flames to rescue wounded comrades, while flamethrower crews continued to operate under small arms fire, maintaining continuous streams to suppress enemy positions. Coordination and courage were tested simultaneously. The success of the assault depended on both technical execution and human endurance. By afternoon, the turning point had crystallized. Japanese defensive lines along the targeted sector had collapsed. The shock delivered by fire, combined with disciplined follow-up infantry movements, ensured that no organized resistance remained. Commanders on both sides recognized the moment's significance. A technological and tactical innovation had altered the dynamics of the battlefield in a matter of hours. What had once required days of attrition and sacrifice was accomplished in a single, coordinated wave of destruction. The impact extended beyond the immediate battle. Japanese forces on adjacent sectors, observing the devastation from a distance, began to falter. Morale weakened, and hesitation replaced decisive action. News of the flamethrowers' effectiveness spread rapidly through communication lines, influencing both defensive strategies and expectations of future engagements. For American forces, the success validated months of experimentation, planning, and rigorous training. As the sun began its descent, the once formidable defensive positions stood empty or smoldering. Survivors either surrendered or retreated inland, leaving behind evidence of the assault's intensity: burned equipment, collapsed bunkers, and the lingering acrid smell of napalm. The battlefield bore witness to the convergence of human courage, technological innovation, and tactical ingenuity, a turning point that would shape the remainder of the Pacific campaign. In these hours, it became clear that flamethrowers fired from ships were more than a weapon. They were a force multiplier, a psychological hammer, and a tactical equalizer. The Japanese defenders' expectations had been shattered. The rules of engagement had changed. The Pacific Islands, with their forbidding terrain and entrenched soldiers, could now be approached with a new combination of precision, firepower, and fear. The stage was set for the aftermath, a battlefield transformed, lives lost, morale shattered, and strategies rewritten. From the searing heat of fire and smoke emerged a lesson in the relentless evolution of warfare, one that would echo through subsequent assaults and leave an indelible mark on both victors and vanquished. By nightfall, the beachhead was secured. What had been an impenetrable network of bunkers, trenches, and caves was reduced to smoldering ruins. American commanders surveyed the scene with a mixture of relief and grim understanding. Flamethrowers had delivered a decisive blow, not only to the Japanese positions, but to the psychological cohesion of their defenders. Units that had once seemed unbreakable were scattered or surrendering, their morale shattered under the relentless combination of fire, smoke, and coordinated assault. Casualty reports began to come in. On the American side, losses were markedly lower than in previous island assaults. Marines who had historically faced deadly machine gun fire and entrenched defenders now advanced behind the protective curtain of flame, avoiding the worst of enemy fire. Dozens were injured or killed in scattered pockets of resistance, but the overall reduction in casualties underscored the operational value of the flamethrowers. Japanese losses, however, were devastating. Hundreds of soldiers were killed outright by direct flame, trapped in bunkers or caves. Others succumbed to heat, smoke inhalation, or disorientation as they attempted to flee. Survivors described the assault in reports and post-war accounts as overwhelming. The water burned. There was no safe place. Everything we relied on was destroyed before we could react. Entire platoons ceased to exist as cohesive units. Commanders attempting to rally troops faced chaos, abandonment, and surrender instead of coordinated defense. Operational reports from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps praised the effectiveness of flamethrowers fired from ships. Task force logs detailed the precision of targeting, the range of the flame projection, and the successful coordination with infantry movements. Engineers noted that the pressurized fuel systems had functioned without catastrophic failure, validating months of development and training. These reports highlighted a new principle of amphibious warfare. Fire could be projected from the sea itself to neutralize entrenched defenders, shortening engagements while minimizing Allied casualties. The strategic significance of this assault extended beyond the immediate beachhead. Commanders recognized that the combination of flamethrowers, artillery, and infantry could redefine island campaigns. Where previous assaults had required prolonged bombardments followed by high-cost infantry attacks, the integration of fire as a primary suppressive tool allowed for faster, more efficient operations. Lessons learned on Okinawa informed subsequent planning for Iwo Jima and smaller island operations, ensuring that flamethrowers would remain a central component of amphibious strategy. The battlefield itself bore the marks of both destruction and innovation. Bunkers that had withstood artillery for weeks were now gutted by fire. Caves, once safe havens for defenders, were rendered untenable. Marines observed the lasting effects of napalm and pressurized fuel on fortifications, noting not only the immediate destruction, but also the psychological impression left on survivors. For Japanese soldiers, the trauma of fire extended beyond physical injury. Surrender became more likely. Hesitation replaced decisive action, and morale suffered long-term degradation. Yet, the aftermath was not solely technical or tactical. Commanders and troops alike understood the human cost of the assault. The flamethrower, as efficient as it was, inflicted intense suffering. Reports emphasized the horror of watching entire positions consumed by fire, the terror experienced by enemy soldiers, and the difficult reconciliation for those who operated the weapon under such conditions. This duality, the operational effectiveness coupled with the moral weight, underscored the brutal realities of warfare in the Pacific. In the quiet hours following the assault, the lessons of the day crystallized. Flamethrowers had delivered a decisive advantage, reshaping the battle in minutes rather than days. Japanese forces had been shocked, dispersed, and fundamentally destabilized. American commanders recognized the convergence of technology, psychology, and tactics that had produced this result, while individual soldiers absorbed the human and moral implications of the destruction they had witnessed. The smoke still hung over the beach as night fell, the last embers of fire illuminating the ruins. From this devastation emerged a new understanding of warfare in the Pacific. Victory would not rely solely on numbers or artillery, but on innovation, coordination, and the unyielding integration of human and technological factors. The stage was set for continued operations inland, where the consequences of the initial assault would ripple through subsequent engagements. In the days following the assault, the effects of the flamethrower deployment became increasingly evident. Japanese defensive operations along the southern Okinawa beaches had been irreversibly disrupted. Units that had survived the initial wave were scattered, exhausted, and demoralized. The collapse of key positions forced Japanese commanders to consolidate forces further inland, abandoning the strategic advantage of fortified coastal defenses. What had been considered nearly impregnable lines of defense now lay in ruins, with survivors retreating into secondary positions that were themselves vulnerable to similar tactics. U.S. operational reports emphasized the psychological as well as the physical consequences of the assault. Marines and sailors noted that even after initial engagements, the mere sight of approaching landing craft equipped with flamethrowers caused hesitation and confusion among defenders. Reconnaissance teams reported that Japanese troops would frequently withdraw from positions before direct engagement, anticipating the arrival of fire. The weapon's ability to instill fear before contact significantly reduced the need for prolonged, attritional combat, marking a shift in amphibious assault strategy. Strategically, the success of flamethrowers reinforced the value of technological innovation in warfare. Task force planners began integrating flamethrowers into all major amphibious operations, recognizing their utility in neutralizing hardened positions that previously required days of artillery and infantry assaults. The rapid neutralization of entrenched defenses shortened campaigns and saved lives among assaulting forces, fundamentally altering the calculus of Pacific operations. Subsequent planning for Iwo Jima, smaller atolls, and inland operations reflected lessons learned. Fire could be projected, controlled, and synchronized with infantry and artillery to maximize operational efficiency. The Japanese military, meanwhile, faced the sobering reality of this technological advantage. Reports from surviving officers highlighted both material losses and the erosion of morale. Troops once trained to fight to the last man now encountered a weapon they could neither anticipate nor resist effectively. Attempts to counter flamethrowers with artillery proved largely futile, as armor and timing rendered most attacks ineffective. The strategic shock extended beyond individual battles. Commanders revised defensive doctrine, but the rapid introduction of flamethrowers meant adaptation lagged behind innovation. In many ways, the Pacific Islands had become laboratories for a new form of combined arms warfare, and Japanese forces were struggling to keep pace. The long-term consequences also touched the human dimension of combat. Survivors of the assaults described the terror of fire as unforgettable, influencing decisions in subsequent battles. Soldiers who experienced flamethrower attacks reported hesitation in holding positions under threat, and entire units developed a heightened sense of vulnerability to future assaults. For U.S. forces, the success of flamethrowers was accompanied by an acute awareness of their destructive power. Crewmen and Marines alike noted the duality of victory: operational efficiency and reduced casualties for their own side, but at the cost of intense suffering inflicted on enemy troops. Historians examining these campaigns have emphasized that the deployment of flamethrowers from ships was not merely a tactical innovation, but a psychological weapon. It combined terror, physical destruction, and operational precision in a way that redefined expectations on both sides. The ripple effect extended across the Pacific. Lessons from Okinawa informed planning for subsequent assaults, while the Japanese military reassessed defensive strategies under the shadow of this new threat. By the end of the month, the once formidable southern defensive lines of Okinawa were effectively neutralized. The battlefield bore the scars of fire and combat, yet these ruins told a story of ingenuity, coordination, and relentless adaptation. American commanders documented both the material success and the psychological impact, recognizing that the flamethrowers had fundamentally altered the dynamics of amphibious warfare. In retrospect, the aftermath of the flamethrower assault illustrates a convergence of technology, human psychology, and tactical brilliance. Japanese defenders were not only physically overwhelmed, they were strategically and emotionally unmoored. For the U.S. forces, the operation confirmed the effectiveness of integrating fire into complex amphibious assaults, establishing a precedent for future operations across the Pacific Islands. The stage was now prepared for reflection. The battle had been won, positions secured, and lessons etched into military doctrine, but the human cost, the psychological shock, and the sheer destructive power of the flamethrower lingered in memory. From this crucible of fire and courage emerged both a tactical innovation and a historical lesson in the relentless evolution of warfare. In the aftermath of the assault, the flamethrowers fired from ships stood as more than a weapon. They became a symbol of innovation meeting necessity, a testament to the relentless evolution of warfare in the Pacific. Technology, human courage, and tactical foresight had converged to reshape the battlefield. Where once entrenched bunkers and cave networks dictated the tempo of combat, fire now imposed a new order. The sea itself had become an instrument of war, projecting not just heat and destruction, but fear, confusion, and surrender. The human dimension remained central. For the Japanese defenders, the assault challenged deeply held beliefs about resilience and honor. Men trained to fight to the last man faced an enemy that rendered fortifications meaningless and demanded surrender under circumstances previously unimaginable. The psychological weight of fire, combined with physical devastation, left an indelible mark, shaping their experience of warfare and their perception of the Pacific conflict. For U.S. forces, the flamethrowers were tools of both protection and destruction, allowing infantry to advance with reduced casualties while confronting the moral realities of delivering overwhelming power against human targets. From a strategic and technological perspective, the success of ship-mounted flamethrowers highlighted the importance of innovation under pressure. Engineers and commanders translated lessons from failure and adaptation into decisive advantage. The ability to project fire from the sea transformed amphibious assault doctrine, shortening campaigns, reducing casualties, and redefining the balance between attacker and defender. Subsequent operations across the Pacific would carry forward this lesson, cementing the weapon's place in military history. Yet, beyond the tactical victories, the campaign leaves a more profound reflection: the intersection of human vulnerability and technological force. Fire, elemental and unyielding, became a language of both terror and power, shaping outcomes before bullets were fired or trenches breached. The events on the beaches, the ridges, and the caves of Okinawa remind us that warfare is not only about strategy and weaponry. It is about the human experience under extreme conditions, the confrontation of fear, and the resilience required to endure. In this convergence of innovation, courage, and horror, the story of flamethrowers fired from ships endures. It is a story of shock and adaptation, of the relentless pursuit of advantage, and of the profound ways in which technology can alter the human dimension of combat. The flames may fade from the beaches of history, but their imprint on strategy, morale, and the psychology of warfare remains, a stark testament to the power and cost of innovation in the crucible of war.